Okay, here we're going to be looking at two-way tables. And we may or may not have talked about this in the past, but we're just going to hit some vocabulary terms, look at exactly what a two-way table is. If you just take the term two-way, you're going to have two different um, categories, I guess you could say, that you are putting into a table. Okay, it's just a different way to organize some data. So the vocab that we're going to go through, first of all, we've kind of already talked about what a two-way table is. So it displays two categories of data collected from the same source, and we'll look more about that in just a minute. But within each two-way table, you have what are called joint frequencies and marginal frequencies. And in your assignment and on your test, you're going to see those terms. So make sure you know the difference between the two. But your joint frequency, that's just another term for every entry that is in the table. All of those numbers that show up in the table, those are your joint frequencies. Your marginal frequencies are going to be come from the sum of all of the rows and all of the columns in the table. So whenever you go through and you add everything in that specific column or everything in that specific row, those are called your marginal frequencies. Okay, so you may need to take a second, pause the video, and get these vocab terms recorded down in your notes before we move on. Okay, now, how do you read a two-way table? Okay, so first of all, if you look at this picture right here, your two-way table, remember we talked about how there are two categories pulled from that data. So you have a student, whether they studied or did not study for a test, and their grade, whether they passed that test or whether they failed that test. So what we're just going to look at right now is reading the table. What do these four numbers in here represent? Okay, these are your joint frequencies. They're just the individual numbers in there. If I were to add them together, 21 plus 1 is 22. That would be a marginal frequency, and we'll look more about that later. But let's take this 21. What does it mean? Okay, we have a student that studied and passed their test. So 21 students studied for the test and passed it. There were 2 students that did not study but also passed. The ones down here, you had 1 student that studied but they failed the test, and you have 6 students that did not study and they also failed the test. So that's kind of how you read the two-way table. So with this question, it says, how many of the students in the survey studied for the test and passed? So if we look, we're going to look at where these two categories meet. So they studied and they passed. And they meet right here. So that would be 21 students that studied and passed the test. Now, moving on, next example, we're going to look more at marginal frequencies. Okay, so finding marginal frequencies. Again, marginal frequencies means we're just going to add all of the columns, all of the rows together. All right, so we have the same table, same two-way table here, students that studied and did not study, whether they passed or failed. So I'm just going to go through and add the rows and add the columns. So 21 plus 2 is 23. That would go right there. Let me extend my table out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and label this total. And I'm going to label this total. Okay? Same thing going across. 1 plus 6 is 7, so I'll put a little 7 right there. Then coming down the columns, 21 plus 1 is 22. 2 plus 6 is 8. And then we're going to have our grand total right here in this corner. 23 plus 7 is 30, and 22 plus 8 is 30. Those should both add up to 30 if you did everything correctly. Now, we need to interpret these marginal frequencies as well. What do they mean? Okay, so this 23, the only place this 23 came from was those that passed the test. You had some that studied and some didn't. So these passed the test. You had 7 that failed the test. Okay, looking at the columns, okay, excuse me, you had 22 students that studied for the test, and you had 8 that did not study for the test. And then this 30 right here, what is that going to represent? Well, that's going to represent the total number of students. Okay, so that's finding the marginal frequencies and then explaining or interpreting what they mean in the context of the situation. Okay, on the next example, we're actually going to be making a two-way table. Okay, so take just a minute. You don't have to write down this paragraph right here, but I do want you to jot down the two tables here and then jot down the two-way table right here. So take a second, pause the video for a minute, get those written down before we move on so you can make sure you're following along with what we're doing. Okay, so you survey students between ages 12 and 17 about whether they ride a bus to school or not. We have these pictures, and we need to make a two-way table. So I've already kind of included the two-way table for you. Students either ride the bus or they don't ride the bus. And then up above I have the age groups that they have broken them down. Okay, so we're just going to fill in numbers. How many 12 to 13-year-olds ride a bus? Well, here's our ride a bus picture. 12 to 13, there were 5, 10, 15, 20, 24. So I'm going to put a 24 right there. Okay. How many 14 to 15-year-olds ride the bus? 5, 10, 12. How many 16 to 17-year-olds ride the bus? 5, 10, 14. Okay. How many don't ride the bus? So for this row, I'm going to be focusing on this picture right here. So do not ride the bus, 12 to 13-year-olds. 5, 10, 15, 16. 14 to 15-year-olds, there are 5, 10, 13. 16 to 17-year-olds that don't ride the bus, there are 5, 10, 15, 20, 21. Okay, so there are my numbers for my two-way table. Okay, now we need to go through and figure out the totals. So take just a minute, pause the video, and I want you to fill in the totals, and you can come back in just a minute and check your answers for those. Okay, so check your totals here, and these are the numbers that you should have gotten. Okay, so we had 50 students total that ride a bus, 50 students total that don't ride a bus. You had 40 12 to 13-year-olds that were surveyed. You had 25 14 to 15-year-olds that were surveyed, and you had 35 16 to 17-year-olds that were surveyed. So that gives you a grand total of 100 students that participated in the survey. All right. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to take your two-way table that you just made, and we're going to focus on finding a relationship, working on percentages. Okay, so if you have room up here in these boxes, just to write a little percentage out beside it, that's fine. Okay, so again, this should just be a review for you, but to find a percentage, you're going to take the number in the box and you're going to divide that by the total and then multiply it by 100. So we'll do a couple together and then I'll have you fill in the rest of it and then you can come back and check it in just a minute. Okay, so what I've done right here is I wrote in the numbers that we had in our table originally, just kind of up into the side so I have room to kind of show you how it's going to work. Now, the whole situation with this problem is you are focused on how many students ride a bus or don't ride a bus, okay? So whenever we go to find the percentages, I said take the number in the box, so 24, you're going to divide it by the total. Well, which total? Do you do this total of 50? Do you do the grand total of 100? Do you do a total of 40? So since we are focused on, there were 24 12 to 13-year-olds that rode a bus. What percentage of 12 to 13-year-olds ride a bus? So we're going to take that 24 and we're going to divide it by this total down here, 40, and then multiply by 100. And you end up getting 60%. So 60% of 12 to 13-year-olds ride a bus. Okay? For them that don't ride a bus, we're going to take 16 divided by 40 times 100, and that will give you 40%. And when you add this up, it should equal 100%. 60 and 40 do equal 100. Okay, for 14 to 15-year-olds, I'm going to divide these by 25. So 12 divided by 25 times 100, that would give you 48%. If you take 13 divided by 25 times 100, that gives you 52%. And together those add up to 100%. And then the last column, we're going to take the number 14, divide it by 35 times 100. You get 40%. And then 21 divided by 35 times 100, you get 60%. Okay, and that will give you 100% of the students in that category. Okay, so just a little review. Finding percentages, you take whatever number's in that box, multiply it by your total, or I'm sorry, divide it by your total, and then multiply it by 100, and that will give you the percentage.